Thank you so much, Desiree, for meeting with me today.
Pleasure's all mine.
Desiree, can you tell me, what did you want to grow up to be when you were a child? And we have known each other since we were both children. You were a little older than me. Not calling you old, but...
Well, I'm sorry to be disappointing as the child of, one Asian parent, but I actually wanted to be a doctor since apparently the age of 3.
Wow. Okay. Tell us why that's so.
Well, I have a theory that, so my mother's obstetrician and gynaecologist was a very prominent female doctor then. Her name was Dr. Lorna Lloyd Green. And I'm the firstborn. So I do have a memory of, going into a Victorian premises in Albert Street, which just happens to be up the road, and, going with the hand down the long corridor, and Mum would peel off to the right into a room, and I would be instructed to go down to the end of the corridor and sit with the nurse. And I understand that the nurse would give me a chocolate biscuit. So, not being slow on the uptake, I think I worked out, and, because Mum had a female doctor, I knew that women could be doctors.
Yeah.
I worked out that the doctor was the owner of the chocolate biscuits. So it's obvious that you would want to become a doctor and have an unlimited supply of chocolate biscuits. Isn't that how you would think at 3?
Indeed. And it's all worked out.
Oh, well, I have jelly beans, but not chocolate biscuits.
Yeah,
but
they melt, don't they? So what about some other experiences that have helped to shape who you are today?
Oh, well, I'm sure you can imagine that when you mentioned to, an Asian parent and equally, Asian cultural adapter mother, that as soon as you said you wanted to be a doctor, that was very strongly encouraged.
Sure.
Right.
What about your Asian heritage? Is that something that has really influenced who you are, and do you align yourself with your cultural heritage very much?
Well, the short answer is yes. My mother deliberately brought us up to be bicultural, I guess you'd say, but I think because, of the White Australia policy and the fact that theirs was a frowned upon union, that in actual fact most of my growing up was around either mixed race families or families like yours, where they'd all met at university and were friends. So I definitely grew up with more Asian influence, also because my dad didn't like Western food that much, so we were mostly fed Chinese food.
And did you have a particular level of awareness that you were an Asian doctor studying medicine? Did that ever really enter your psyche?
Well, I guess it's interesting. I remember feeling threatened for a racial reason when I was about 7 at the public pool, and then I have another time of feeling racially threatened when I was about 11 or 12 in a country town. And other than that, not especially until I became an intern. And back in those days, particularly at the hospital that I got my internship with, I didn't actually notice that a lot of the Asian kids had been relatively, overachievers at academia, but they didn't actually turn up so much in the workforce. So it was pointed out to me subsequently that, that basically not as many people with Asian names got jobs at the more prestigious hospitals, but I don't know. It was something that hadn't actually super occurred to me, because I still believed at that point in the concept of merit, and that if you did well in your exams and you were hardworking and all of those, that you would achieve. And it took me a really long time to work out that there's a hidden curriculum or a hidden agenda, or,
many factors
stuff
that come
didn't
into
just
play.
work out how I thought it might.
Yeah.
So, that was kind of, has been a lifelong learning, I guess you could say, that became evident to me later about what sort of sociological factors had been at play at the time.
You, in your current role, you work with people, you manage people, your clients are people. What have you learned about humans and humanity over your years? You can, professionally, even personally.
Well, I don't know. Sometimes, I think I find people really interesting. So I guess all I've learned is that they continue to be really interesting, and that I do like the diversity of people. I like trying to understand people and understand where they're coming from. But that's partly because it makes me better at trying to treat them, I guess, or look after them or help them, achieve their own sort of better outcomes, I guess, from a, gynecological or a women's health point of view.
I was reading an interview that you did it may have been recently, and
you poor thing.
It was really interesting, actually. But I remember just off the top of my head that you said that kindness and empathy are really, really key. I can't remember whether you were talking about when you mentor people or whether it's in your dealings, in your practice.
Oh, no, I think that is that's just something I wish more people would make as a priority for themselves and how they interact with the world. But I don't think it costs anything to be kind, and I don't understand why people aren't more empathetic, but, I don't think that's a difficult thing to be. And I don't know why we seem to see so increasingly less of that kind of thing in the world we live in.
So you lead a small team and have done in the past. How do you lead? Do you lead with empathy? How do you inject your own personal values into your leadership?
Well, I think it's really, one of the things is to really appreciate the strengths and weaknesses of the people in your team, and that, I always go, there's no I in team.
There is an individual reward is the other part that some people quote, but that's a bit naughty.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard that one. But I think that, early in my sort of leadership development, a friend of mine observed that, if you look at Survivor and all those reality shows that are not real at all, that you never want to be the one that picks up the pen first. Because they're always the one that get chucked out, apparently, because I've actually never watched an episode of Survivor, because I really it's an anathema to me, that whole concept that you only want one person left at the end, because I would be saying we want all of the people left at the end.
Yeah.
So I tend to have a leadership style that's lead from behind, because I think that one of the really important things to do is to build your team. Your team should be better than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
And that you can't do that if you centre yourself as the centre of the team.
Sort of like, there's a type of leadership called servant leadership.
That's the model.
And I feel like that
that is definitely my model of leadership.
Serve your people.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that I think there's a bit of Asian influence too, about the joy should be in the student outshining the master, that you build somebody that will be bigger than you or better than you at what you do, and that's actually the sign of success. Is more about what else you've done or led or leave behind or any of those things.
That's a really generous mindset. You of course have mentored a lot of people, a lot of students, a lot of women. Do you think that women lift other women up? Do you think that there should be more support beyond mentorship into sponsorship?
Well,
into roles?
I don't actually think that it's the job of women to acknowledge particularly women, because, we shouldn't be in our own category. And so I think one of the things that makes people ask those kind of questions is because traditionally women have to compete with other women for the very few seats that they're given at the leadership table, and that's why we see the behaviour that we see from some women, is because they're fighting for the one seat that that women are allowed to have. So the actual competitors are the other women rather than the whole table, all the seats at the table.
Is that changing? In your industry?
No, I'm not sure that it is, and I don't think it's just my industry that's not changing. I think it's very difficult for people who have gained power for whatever reason to actually give it up. And so I guess the idea I like people to have about leadership is that, there's a hall of people.
Yes.
And a bunch of people who get to sit on the podium.
Yes.
And that traditionally, men have had all the seats up the front, and then the women have increasingly been, they were first of all relegated not even into the hall, and then they fought to get into the hall, but basically the seats at the back. And that essentially, if you want a seat up the front or you want a seat up at the podium, then actually somebody has to be willing to give up their seat and move back to let somebody move forward. And it's that letting of somebody move forward that the whole concept is a problem, and that, of course, there's not many people that want to give up their good seat to go and sit at the back. However it is that they got their good seat.
Yeah. So it's
been and that most people think that they deserve the good seat that they have because they've worked so hard.
Yes.
And so why should they give that up to someone else? So so you're not going to get to the front of the hall and you're not going to get onto the podium unless somebody is prepared to vacate that seat.
Yeah.
In the current climate.
You mentioned just before working hard, and indeed, you do work in a really pressured environment, industry, and have done. I'm really curious as to how you shut off at the end of the day. I mean, you must in your time, and I'm not asking you to quote specifically, but you must in your time have experienced and seen difficult situations. And then I've heard from many medical professionals, we just go home and then have to try and cope with things. Has that been your experience? What coping strategies have you used?
Well, high on my list of coping strategies is actually gin. And I know you've interviewed Bassett Flinders.
That's right. That's a lovely sort of segue back to interview Holly Clintworth, if you're listening. Yes.
So, no. I think that that unfortunately the older I get, the more reliant on gin I've become, but which is not good, okay? That is not a good coping mechanism. And more, but well, I'm getting increasingly fussy. It's gentrified over the years,
right.
How much I'm prepared to spend on my gin. But in all seriousness, I think that part of the gift of being able to do medicine is the capacity to compartmentalise. And so I think that certainly I can go home quite, shall we say, centrally agitated from my day. And my kids will tell you that I was pretty shouty as a parent. And
perfect.
I'm just waiting for them to have their own kids and we'll see how shouty they are. But I think that certainly I probably would have a lower, stress tolerance at home, but I think that I'm also able to get out of the car, shut the door and compartmentalise back into my domestic life. And that's not to say that, I haven't got things that you might describe as PTSD-ish over different events that have happened in my career. But I think overall in the days that I did medicine, if you couldn't survive the first 2 years of cutting up dead bodies for 6 hours a week, they cut out for us. It cuts you out for a certain personality to do.
Yeah, because we
medicine.
Talked a little bit about vicarious trauma, when we were messaging each other, I mean, surely that's still a factor in the medical profession's well-being.
Oh, for sure. I think that accounts for the high burnout rates, the high suicide rates, the high dropout rates, all of those things for sure. Is that if you can't, you can't or you don't, or just even the number of remarriages, right? The number of divorces and repartnerships and all of those sorts of things. Because certainly traditionally in medicine, it's a very male-dominated profession, and so to have any weakness was kind of something you didn't show, and mental health issues would be a weakness, and so people did all sorts of sort of personality adaptations. So you were either already neurodiverse when you went into medicine, which by definition you sort of had to be, and then there was a culture that was very male-dominated. A lot of the medical hierarchy systems were based on army systems. So, because lots and lots of medical practices really in the West has come out of the British Army kind of set up all the way back to the sort of Florence Nightingale times. And so, hierarchical, stiff upper lip, don't show weakness, get on with it, bravado, how big a lump can I take out of somebody, what can I get named after myself?
Tough.
So that's the culture, changing somewhat, but I think hard to say how much that's still pervasive. I know that for some decades now they've been selecting medical students according to different selection criteria than when they selected me. I won't say how many years ago, but a long time. And I think that's still an ongoing sort of big social experiment for what that looks like. But, we've had a lot of industrial activity about safe working hours and all of those things that didn't exist when I was a doctor in training. So,
interesting.
When most people complain that, they can't get into their GP because they're not there often enough, but if you're going to have a work-life balance, then you've got to be not there sometimes, right? Which means there's a big tension between people still wanting access to their same GP, for example, whenever they want them. They'd often prefer to have a woman because female doctors, there is an evidence base to say they get better outcomes. I'll be a bit inflammatory there, but and unfortunately you cannot get all of those things all together without getting a personality that needs time out or will get burnt out.
Absolutely.
Or all of those things. So there's quite a tension between community expectations and the community ideal of a perfect doctor, and that a perfect doctor is not going to work 120 hours a week.
No, absolutely not. You've actually carved out a name for yourself in women's health, in being an advocate in women's health. Can you tell us more about that? What are you specifically advocating for?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't use the word carved out because it was kind of an accident. I mean, I didn't try exactly. It's just that
you accidentally ended up with an Order of Australian Medicine. Is that?
No, that's because I have very good friends and colleagues who organised it, and I still don't know who they are. But I've got a bit of an idea though. But
so do I.
Oh, you think so? You can tell me later. I think that there's a few things at play there. It's an interesting question to think about. So first of all, I tend to always barrack for the underdog, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what sports thing I turn on, because I don't follow Aussie rules much, but I'll always barrack for the losing team, which is not very satisfying in the greater scheme of things. But I talk about how I became a gynaecologist, because I used to go, well, I'll become a gynaecologist because it's the worst, thing I could ever imagine doing. That's what I said as a medical student. Really? And I said, and you always end up doing the thing you said you'd never do. But, I got to 5th year medicine, and we do in those days we did 6 months of paediatrics and 6 months of women's health, and I was so appalled by, you know, what I saw in my lecturers and what people didn't know about women's health but were prepared to make a statement about it when it seemed really complicated. So, you know, I wasn't sure how the answer could be, you know, it's in her head or she's hysterical or something, when there were like all these big black boxes of non-information that we didn't know how it worked. So how could that be your conclusion, was that, you know, and so that goes back to the whole hysteria part of our culture. But that equally it was a complete blast delivering my first baby, right? Never forgotten that. Often wonder what he's up to, because he must be in his mid to late 30s by now. Because, you know, I delivered my first baby as a fifth year medical student. So, and you know, when I had to sit with the family while the woman was in labour, and it, you know, took about 8 hours, and you know, we all cried when the baby was born, and God, it was fantastic, and I was hooked on the obstetrics and appalled by the gynecology, and had sort of thought I wanted to become a surgeon, but in those days, you know, becoming a female surgeon was extremely difficult. I mean, you know, it was maybe at best 4% of women were surgeons, and it was, you know, it was incredibly difficult, and merit didn't really get you there. So
is that percentage a little higher now?
Well, so if you take it that I graduated in 1987, and I was the first year of 50% women in medicine, right? And you think about my cohort now being at 60, the 50% kind of moved through, because that's when they believed in the pipeline theory, and you know, we were still hung up on merit, you know, that if you got into the pipeline and you did all the right things, you'd spit out to the other end. It wasn't about the whole leaky pipe thing. So yes, many more women are achieving higher positions in medicine, but it's still disproportionate if you just look at the number of professors versus, you know, lecturers, teachers, people who own practices, all of that kind of thing. It's still pretty male dominated, and now we know, I think, I'm not particularly up with the current numbers, but it was 40% of women enter surgical training, but that is not who comes out the other end. It's more interesting to look at what's happening between the in and the out, I guess. And I'd quite like for that study to be done. I'd like for people to look at my generation and each of the decades behind me and look at what the inflow was and what the outflow was. And even in my career, it's not that we didn't become specialists, but did we become heads of department, or you know, did we elect to go into private practice because structures within the public hospitals were not conducive? Because, you know, conversely to what you might expect, you know, if you go into private practice, in fact, you've got more freedom to call the shots on your hours. And, you know, if you want to start later so you can take your kids to school, then you can. And you're not bound by the sort of traditional sort of employee kind of hours and all of those kind of things. So in actual fact, for women in my age group, particularly in O&G, that you could be more successful and earn more money in private whether you wanted to be there or not.
And be able to conduct your personal life
because,
in a really,
you know,
practical way, which is necessary if
that's
you
right.
are
But it's
a
you know, you could argue that that's a loss to the public health system, isn't it? Because you're creating a kind of sociological impact that may not be the produce your sort of optimum outcomes, I guess you'd say. So it's the same thing.
It's complicated, and
but it's the same thing as that merit argument about leadership, right? And that, you know, companies with boards, you know, that are more mixed gender get better outcomes, right? And that probably because, you know, the mediocre men have to make way for the you know, appropriately qualified women, and that you actually get better outcomes. So I think at my age now, I think about what could it have been,
Yeah.
if we hadn't had those sort of socially constructed barriers, I guess.
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk, and there is a lot of talk about menopause and work. Are you happy that people are starting to have a talk about this, and it's not a sort of a hidden issue that, oh, we don't talk about that? Are you glad that it's being talked about by employers and females in the workforce?
I think it's interesting that it's a bit like the clitoris, really, isn't it? That it's sort of been, it's going to be, menopause has been discovered by social media, right? As if
yes,
it
never
hasn't been a thing. But, you know, if you look at the work of Dr. Jean Hales, who set up the first menopause clinic back in the, I think it was the mid-80s, might have even been the early 70s. You know, the 70s feminists already put menopause on the agenda. It's just that there weren't a lot of ways of disseminating the information, I guess. But if you look at the history of Jean Hales and the work that I have no, interest in the Jean Hales Foundation, but they have really, to give them their credit, been around for decades, providing, quality information and education for women. But yes, it's the social media capacity that has really driven a lot of the menopause chit-chat that we have now. And that, again, I have a perspective of being around back in, 2002 when hormone therapy causes breast cancer. And,
yes.
The paper was released, that scientific paper for the first time ever was released to the media before it was released to peers for analysis. And so the whole thing took off by itself before it actually had considerations for the flaws in the study and all of those sorts of things. So, I find myself in the situation where, 20 years of women being afraid of hormone therapy and menopause and breast cancer, suddenly we're, 180 degrees and everybody wants to be on it.
Yes.
And that some of that's all just a sort of social construct as well. And that I think the other thing that social media does is, women's health is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Whether it's a multi-billion-dollar industry for big pharma, it's also a multi-billion-dollar industry for the supplement industry. It's just a multi-billion-dollar industry about that nexus of women ageing and women, in fact, going through menopause, which I say all the time is just puberty backwards, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know it's going to happen. You're not quite sure when it's going to happen. You're not quite sure how it's going to happen. You don't know whether it's going to be smooth or rocky.
No.
And you don't know if you're still going to be getting pimples at 30, right? I mean, that's really the story of menopause. Is exactly like puberty, but the other way around, as you transition back to no periods, and that we have all these sort of constructs around it that is not treating it as we treat puberty, which is a process, sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes problematic and sometimes easy. So, we sort of say 20% of women will have no problems with menopause. They're just going to go in, have it, all going to be fine, and, the periods will just stop and it'll all be fine. And that we have 20% of women for whom it's really terrible and they have a lot of problems with it and they need help with that. And then there's 60% of people that get something, and then it's a interaction between, where do they live, because hotter climates it's harder to deal with your hot flushes. Where do they live, what work are they doing, and what are their cluster of symptoms that they're getting.
So there's been a lot talked about and promoted on social media, but is there almost too much information, and
I think it's
misinformation or disinformation? I'm not sure which is the right term.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure either. I think that first of all, there's a lot of money in it, and any industry that's got a lot of money to be made is going to be tricky.
Yeah.
And that, I guess I tell people to follow the money, right? So if somebody is going to be selling you something at the end of their message to you, then
Ask
it's a paid
questions.
advertisement, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's. I think that's the problem with social media, is that people's qualifications can be unclear. We know that people respond to anecdotal, this happened to me, and so that'll be good for you, kind of messaging, and it's just as silly as saying, well, my periods are like this, and so your periods should be like this. Or, my childbirth experience was like this, and if you do what I do, your childbirth experience will be like this. I mean, it's just not how it works.
It's vastly different.
Well, first of all, if you didn't do your due diligence on the size of your partner's head, and thought about how that might come out with your baby's head, it's just a non-comparison, right?
Yeah.
And so, sure, there's some basic things about being healthy and keeping well to assist in any health sort of transition or optimising, but...
Can I ask you you talk about basics. Can you talk about basics in terms of supplements? Are there basic supplements that women should be taking?
So no. So I think that if you eat a healthy, balanced diet, with whole foods and, do the right thing, don't drink too much gin.
But I don't need to be rushing off to the pharmacy to buy magnesium, for example, or...
Well, I think it depends on what's happening to you. Well, speaking as somebody who does take a bit of extra magnesium, is that, I think there's some evidence for it, but I don't know that it's necessarily a panacea, or that everybody has to be on it. And you can overdose on magnesium if you try hard enough. And the same with the vitamin Bs, is that, people can get toxicity. So I think the idea that you just go, I need to pick me up, and then go and get flogged something by either an influencer on social media, or your pharmacist who's going to make money out of your supplement, or your naturopath, or anybody else, that's problematic, because follow the money. And
so we should pause and think before we act.
Well, we should be thinking about, does the person who's giving you advice have a pecuniary interest in it, right?
Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing that a lot of people don't know is that the reason doctors here can't sell medications like they can in lots and lots of places overseas is because that is a regulated reduction of conflict of interest.
Yes.
Right? So I can write the prescription, but I theoretically, and I have to say that the pharmaceutical laws are very stringent in Australia, is that I technically do not make any money out of advising you to have a certain drug.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Or to go to the pharmacist and pick up a supplement, or something like that, right? Is that I technically don't have a conflict of interest over that. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah.
So I think that you want to look for the people who are prepared to give you information for free, where they've got a passion about the subject, and have studied the science and understand how to compare evidence, and have no obvious way of getting a kickback from, so they're not recommending a certain brand, or they're not they're not telling you to go somewhere to buy it. They're not, there's no apparent agenda other than that they've got a passion for the subject, right? And that they want women to be well.
Yeah.
And I certainly in my practice direct people that want to know more about their, diet and those sorts of things to free resources. Because, there's recipes. And again, I've got no connection with Jean Hales, but they've got a fantastic naturopath who puts recipes on their website for free, right? There's no gain for the healthy recipes that she that are free for everybody on the website, because...
So we need to look for that transparency, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. Last question, Desiree.
Oh, and I'm having so much fun.
No, I know, and I'm having so much fun getting all this advice from you and stories. I want you to respond to it. All journeys have secret destinations of which the traveller is unaware. I'll just say that again. All journeys have secret destinations of which the traveller is unaware. How would you respond to that quote?
I think I've always made journeys where I want to know that I don't have any particular expectation about the destination.
Really?
And that actually I'm looking for the surprise, if you like, or the unexpected. So I actually quite like that quote, but I'd be saying that actually that's why I do journeys, is because I quite like not knowing what how it's exactly going to work out. And I know that early and it still would be a problem in my career, but when that fashion came in and where do you see yourself in 5 years, I wouldn't be able to answer that question, because I'm like, I don't know. I mean, it's going to depend on what happens in the next 5 years, because that might be interesting. So I'm going to go off. So, when you ask me how did I end up here, I ended up here because I was open to,
answers
what
around
that happened, and I really struggled. Well, it was, it's obstetrics and gynecology. I stopped obstetrics because, once I had my own children, it was really hard to be that disrupted, and because I wanted to have my focus on my children, because if somebody's in labour, certainly for me, I would always have part of my brain is until that baby is out and safe, that's taking up some of my mental load, and that I wanted to be able to focus my mental load on my kids, and that I thought kids needed to know that when they woke up, who was going to be in the house, that you hadn't rushed off for a delivery at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then they're going to wake up to a lot of disruption about routine, and that what's the point of having your kids if you're not going to spend a bit of time bringing them up. But it was just being open to what was a need and then go and fill it. And so there was no active carving out of anything. It was just, who's that character? Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to go there. Maybe a bit like, the donkey in Shrek, or something of, that needs to be done. So somebody, I could have a tattoo for somebody across here, because it's like, somebody needs to go and do that, and so I'd be the somebody. So
you make it sound as if it's been a bit like a meandering journey, but it's worked out really well for you, I have to say, Desiree.
Well, maybe it just looks like that, but my kids still tell me I was shouty as a parent. Yeah, but not in a conventional sense. Like I'm happy with where I'm at, but not in a conventional way of, I'm not Professor Yap or, Australian of the Year, or no, I'll never be an academic professor. I can't keep my interest in an area that gets funding for long enough, because I'm always distracted by the area of need.
Yeah. No, I love that. Dr. Desiree Yap, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for being interested enough to talk to me.
Thank you.